And thank you for joining us. Um, we have a few people who are going to continue to trickle in over the next couple minutes, but in keeping with the Hazardous workshop tradition, we're going to go ahead and get this started promptly. On behalf of the fellows and faculty affiliated with the Bill Anderson Fund, I would like to welcome you to our annual session where we give lightning talks and traditional style research talks that highlight some of the research being done by the fabulous fellows who are currently involved or engaged in the Bill Anderson Fund process. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the Bill Anderson Fund in just a minute, but I did want to take a quick second to introduce myself. My name is Asia Doughton. I am a faculty member at Michigan State University, where I'm in the Department of Forestry. My current work focuses on urban forest hydrology and looking at how we can use various tree species to create green infrastructure within urban environments to help mitigate flood risk in our cities here in Michigan, across the United States, and across the world. I will be honest and say that before landing at Michigan State University, I, like many students going through my graduate program, had an idea of the things that I wanted to pursue upon graduation, but really needed guidance from my peers, faculty mentors, professionals in the field to kind of help shape this interest and realize where it might be of impact, both within the academy and in the broader world. And I really strongly believe that I would not have gotten the guidance that I needed had it not been for my opportunity to participate in the Bill Anderson Fund while I was a graduate student. And so I say all that to say that though a relatively young organization, the impact of the Bill Anderson Fund is deep and wide-reaching for so many of us who have been able to go through the program, benefit from the myriad professional development activities built into the program, and then are now serve in a position to sort of give back. And it's, as such, a joy for me to be here today and to celebrate some of the work being done by the current scholars in the program. So we're going to get into the talks provided by the scholars in just a moment, but I did want to take a quick second to provide a brief background to the Bill Anderson Fund and how the organization has reached the levels that it has today. So are you all able to see my screen? I believe you should be. All right, so once again, welcome to the Bill Anderson Fund Lightning Talks powered by PechaKucha. Just a brief aside, PechaKucha, I'm never sure if I'm saying that correctly, but it's a Japanese style of providing talks, and a lot of conferences have adopted it in recent years, but essentially it's based on giving a good amount of information in a short amount of time. Slides that have, essentially the presentation is delivered in a form where the slides have fewer text and you have a limited amount of time to get through the slide. And it essentially helps you to make sure that your points are made concisely, clearly, and you get to the meat of the message in a way that keeps up with the attention span of the audience. So we'll be doing that style today, or mixing our talks with that traditional style. But before we get to our talks, a little background on the BAF. Let's see. Okay. So the Bill Anderson Fund was founded in honor of the late Bill Anderson, whom many of you all know was an invaluable contributor to the field of natural hazards and disaster science. Bill contributed much in the way of scholarship, practice, forward thinking, both in the academy with think tanks and with federal agencies over the course of his long career. And regardless of where Bill was stationed and contributing work, scholarship, he held a few convictions near to his heart and also made sure that he used his abilities and his influence to bring those convictions to life and change the field. And chief among those convictions was that when Bill would have the opportunity to travel to conferences across the United States and beyond, he would often realize that in the great body of scholars, he was often one of the only, if not the only person of color in the field. And given the nature of disasters and how they tend to disproportionately impact vulnerable communities, he strongly believed that those who are doing the work to figure out how we can better serve the public in times of disaster should more closely reflect the American public and, honestly, the people who tend to be most negatively impacted. And so he put the work in, especially when he had an opportunity to serve at NSF, to ensure that he gave opportunities for underrepresented populations, often meaning people of color, often meaning women, to receive the mentorship that they need, to receive the funding that they needed, to establish research programs, and to do the scholarship that would really help to advance the field, number one, and number two, to do so in a way that was reflective, again, of the American public. And so Bill lived and lived very closely to those convictions until his untimely passing in 2013. And after his passing, his wife, Norma Anderson, was very much so committed to keeping that vision moving forward and making sure that there were pathways in place to allow for scholars of color in this discipline to receive the mentorship that they need while still in school so that they can graduate and contribute to the world in meaningful ways and in ways that make sure that all populations are represented in the disaster science field. So with that said, in 2014, Norma pushed forward and was able to assemble a body of young scholars, all of whom were in their graduate programs at the time, and worked with them to develop this program that has now blossomed into what we know today as the Bill Anderson Fund. Again, founded in 2014, and in 6 short years, this program has grown immensely. It is now comprised of 34 current active fellows who are now based at approximately 20 institutions of higher learning across the United States. Within the 6-year time span, we've had a lot of growth, not just in numbers, but also in terms of the scope of the work that we do with the BAF and the great institutions that we are affiliated with. In terms of institutional affiliation, in 2018, we joined forces with the University of Delaware and established a partnership that essentially rooted us as having a flagship institution with the University of Delaware. This puts us in a position to have a permanent academic home and a place in which we can really align with a university that is a leader in the field. Current leadership of the BAF flagship is under the direction of Professor Monica Sanders. And again, we have 34 active fellows who, as a part of this program, receive numerous opportunities throughout the year to engage in professional development that really sharpens their skills, broadens their networks, and puts them in a position to be of the utmost success once they graduate. These workshops occur at various institutions across the US annually and culminates with the opportunity for students to present their research right here in this session each year at the Natural Hazards Workshop. In addition to the 3 annual workshops that students do, there are multiple webinars that students are able to engage in, and then we also have an annual fundraiser in the Disaster Dash. And as much as we have active fellows, we also have fellows who have been active, graduated, and are now contributing in the professional world, and we have a budding network of about 25 alumni from the BAF fellows. Looking forward to today's talks, I want to briefly highlight or introduce and highlight those who we have who are going to be speaking, starting with Felicia Henry, who is working on her PhD at the University of Delaware. Felicia's work links systemic oppression with outcomes in disasters, particularly for incarcerated populations. And this is all a part of her doctoral scholarship in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice. After Felicia, we will have a talk given by Natasha Malmin, who is studying public policy at Georgia State University and Georgia Institute of Technology. Natasha's work is associated with administrative burdens linked with federal disaster recovery efforts for vulnerable populations, specifically those with disability. Her research interests also include participatory GIS mapping, long-term community resilience, and emergent collective warning systems before disasters. After Natasha, we'll have Farah Nibbs of the University of Delaware. Farah's work is all part of her PhD program in the Disaster Science and Management program at UD. And she looks specifically at climate change adaptation for Caribbean small island developing states, with a focus on water security in the face of changing climate. After Farah, we'll have a talk given by Valerie Washington, who's at the University of Michigan and working on a PhD in the Department of Industrial and Operations Engineering. Valerie's work currently examines the determinants of hurricane evacuation times, using agent models to understand the influences of flood insurance subsidies for various communities. And last but not least, we'll have a talk given by Alex White, who is working on her PhD at Michigan State University in the Department of Forestry. And Alex's work is done as a part of her membership in the Human Dimensions of Forestry Lab. Her current research examines the relationship between people and trees in urban environments. And she looks specifically on assessing the risk of hazard trees in residential neighborhoods. Without further ado, I'm gonna open the floor to our speakers, and we will welcome Felicia from the University of Delaware.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is Felicia Henry, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Delaware in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department. Thank you for attending my presentation entitled The Disaster of Injustice, COVID-19 in Prisons. I intend to briefly highlight the impact of COVID-19 on prisons in New York State. I'd like to set the foundation with the literature of the carceral system and disasters. Most of what we know is based on damage to physical facilities, like in the event of a hurricane. I'd like to set the foundation with the literature of the carceral system and disasters. Most of what we know is based on damage to physical facilities, like in the event of a hurricane, incarcerated folks' labor, like firefighters, and most of all, how emergency planning is deprioritized for them and the legal obligations for their social welfare are often violated. The theories or approaches that I'd like to ground this presentation in are social vulnerability and structural violence. These concepts tells us that disaster outcomes for certain populations differ because of social factors, and institutions like the carceral facilities, quote, kill slowly because of the disproportionate distribution of resources. I use the convergent mixed methods design, which includes both quantitative and qualitative data, collected around the same time from the Correctional Association of New York. The two data sources are a family survey, respondents who are family and friends of incarcerated individuals, and letters written directly from incarcerated individuals themselves. There are 38,390 individuals incarcerated in 52 facilities across New York State, supervised and run by the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, or DOCS. Almost half of them are Black, which already highlights the major disparities for a population that is marginalized and socially vulnerable. The first figure you see is the infection rate of New York State compared to selected New York State prisons. The infection rate of New York is 2.05%, but the infection rate of Otisville Correctional Facility is 7.95%, almost 4 times higher. So we are already seeing disproportionate infections behind bars. This second figure is from the family survey. When asked what were the concerns of their incarcerated loved ones, the top 3 were lack of personal protective equipment at over 86%, concern about medical treatment at over 67%, and facility staff response to COVID also at over 67%. This third figure is also from the family survey. When asked what were their own concerns, the top 3 were COVID infections in the facility at over 84%, lack of preventative measures in the facility at over 78%, and the impact of their loved ones' mental health at over 73%. So we're seeing some overlap with their reports of their loved ones. This last figure from the family survey represents the respondents' satisfaction with the response of docs to COVID. Over 44% rated docs at a 1, the worst rating on the scale, and over 95% rated docs the 4 lowest ratings on the scale. So there's a large dissatisfaction toward the agency responsible for the social welfare of their loved ones. Transitioning to the second data set, the letters from incarcerated individuals, we found 3 overall themes: vulnerability, fear, specifically of abuse and manipulation, and concern for their own health and well-being. The first theme is vulnerability. This first letter talks about how the virus cannot infect those incarcerated unless someone brings it in. Their confinement eliminates their mobility, and thus they are exposed and vulnerable to those who come in. Additionally, that exposure increases in the absence of protective measures like mentioned here. This letter discusses the reality that some people may contract the virus and be okay, but they may pass it to someone who would not. This individual understands the vulnerable position others who cannot withstand the virus are in and urges those who come in and out of the facility to, quote, stay home until the danger is over. The second theme is fear, particularly of abuse and manipulation. This individual makes the claim that COVID is being used as a tool to, quote, abuse and manipulate the population because of docs' unstandardized response. This points us back to structural violence in that institutions determine access to resources and, in this case, preventative measures. This letter highlights manipulation in that the individual talks about a previous attempt to remove visitation policies prior to the pandemic. Though they understand the need for this move now in terms of safety, they cannot help but contextualize it with other moves to diminish the social resources of those incarcerated. The last theme is concern for health and well-being. This individual, also mentioning abuse of the pandemic, says that they are simply, quote, trying to stay healthy and corona-free, which is much like the rest of what we call the free population, indicating their similar concerns to be safe. And lastly, this letter again highlights inconsistent policies and practices on the part of docs and how this can increase folks' exposure to the virus. They say, quote, please take into consideration that I'm worried about everyone's exposure to COVID-19. So with the 2 data sources, we see overlapping themes: concerns about health and safety, lack of trust and satisfaction in the response of docs, and increased vulnerability of those behind bars. This also shows us the culture of neglect and trauma that a carceral facility often does not prioritize and uphold their legal obligations to take care of incarcerated people. Lastly, it also gives us insight to understanding how the pandemic is being experienced by those who are directly impacted by it, including family and friends of loved ones who are incarcerated, and also the incarcerated individuals themselves. So there are several policy implications from this. The first is identifying incarceration in the conversations about state violence. As we call for justice for Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, we must recognize that their violent endings are known, and those who experience the same violence behind bars are not. So we cannot leave incarceration out. Second, we need to expand and prioritize emergency planning for incarcerated individuals and specifically designate them as a vulnerable population. We need to reduce the number of people behind bars for the length of time that they are there, and also center the voices of those directly impacted as they guide and shape our work down to what we consider as data. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you to the Natural Hazards Workshop for hosting me and you all for attending.
Thank you, Felicia, for a great talk. I meant to mention this earlier. We have, the way we were gonna do this today is we'll have all of our presenters give their talks, and then we'll follow up with questions after the last speaker's talks. If you have a question that that comes to your mind while someone's presenting and you would like for it to be answered later, please feel free to put it in the chat in the meantime, and we'll make note of it and ask it towards the end. With that, we'll now welcome Natasha.
thank you all. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you all for the opportunity to present here, specifically my GSU advisor, Dr. Ann Margaret Esnard, Dr. Lori Peak, Dr. Jennifer Tobin, and the BAF, of course, for this wonderful opportunity. I'm really excited to present my lightning talk, which will be on my dissertation proposal. So research tells us that disasters in scale and magnitude are not equally distributed throughout our society, and so neither is recovery. When jurisdictions are overwhelmed by disasters, the federal government may step in, marshaling huge resources to restore the social contract between individual, community, and government. My research looks at how the government delivers these huge resources, and if in the manner doing so brings about inequitable recovery. Specifically, I will be using public administration theory to understand the outcomes and barriers to federal recovery assistance. My public administration theory of choice is that of administrative burden, with its origins in red tape. So red tape theory states that rule constraints influences organizational performance. When you constrain an organization's ability to perform, it imposes costs on its clients. When the organization is the government, the client is the citizen, and the costs are differentially imposed along pre-existing lines of social inequality, you have administrative burden. In reviewing the administrative burden literature, I identified 3 thematic areas which converge to form administrative burden. These are social vulnerability, the bureaucracy itself, and value-laden politics. Other theories and traditions also influences the experience of administrative burden, such as policy feedback and the representative bureaucracy, but they may do so in indirect ways. Within the administrative burden literature, much of the research is often focused on means tested programs, such as Medicaid and child welfare programs. I propose to look at administrative burden in non-means tested programs, specifically federal recovery assistance after Harvey in marginalized communities. Hurricane Harvey impacted the state of Texas on August 25th, 2017 as a Category 4 hurricane. The storm cost 68 lives and a total of estimated $125 billion in economic damages. President Trump declared Harvey a federal disaster, paving the way for federal funds to assist in the recovery efforts. My first research question looks at FEMA's individual assistance within communities of color and communities with higher levels of pre-existing disability. Within the Houston area, research already found that communities with higher disabled populations faced greater Harvey flooding exposure, and persons of color were less likely to receive federal assistance. My main hypothesis is, despite FEMA's stated policy goals and the Americans with Disabilities Act requiring equal access, communities with greater disabled present would receive less federal funding, and the more money distributed, the greater the disparity across communities. I define community at the zip code level. I will use FEMA's individuals and household program data, as well as the American Community Survey estimates on total disability. I will assess zip codes within all counties which receive federal disaster declaration, controlling for various factors. My second research aim is to evaluate individual level access to federal assistance and whether access to this federal assistance influenced perceptions of statewide recovery 6 months after the storm. My main hypothesis here is that applicants from vulnerable households would be more likely to have their applications delayed or denied. Individuals who experience these forms of administrative burden would be less likely to have recovered 6 months later and more likely to have negative perceptions on statewide recovery efforts. Here, my unit of analysis is at the individual level. I have access to over 850,000 unique registrant data from FEMA's Individuals and Household Program, as well as survey data collected 6 months after the storm with a 24-county sampling frame. My last research aim focuses on long-term impacts of federal funding disparities and whether or not these disparities promote further social inequity. I'm looking at changes in wealth generation through changes in median home prices over time for communities by level of access to federal funding assistance. My main hypothesis here is that communities which have poor access to federal assistance will see a disintegration of wealth through lowering of median home values over time, occurring primarily in already vulnerable communities. I define community at the zip code level. I have individual small business administration home loan data, which I will aggregate up to the zip code level. I also have median monthly housing value estimates up to 2 years after the storm. So why is this important? This proposed study will look at recovery from distinct vantage points of vulnerability, specifically disability, perceptions of the state, and long-term wealth generation, all of which have implications on civil rights and the citizen-state interaction. In addition, the study takes into account recovery outside of major cities, which is also often forgotten. But most importantly, with COVID-19, we see that how we structure pre-disaster policies matter. We live interconnectedly, and what we've pushed to the fringes through either haphazard or sometimes willfully burdensome policy designs will affect our recovery as a whole. Thank you all for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Natasha, for another great presentation. We'll now welcome Farah to the stage to present her research.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen right now. So my research, this is actually a research that was conducted in 2018 in the island of Grenada, and there has obviously been some updates in regards to that. So my research focused on the issue of climate change and the possibility of using, or the potential of using, rainwater harvesting as a form of water security, particularly in the face of climate change for small island developing states. Small island developing states, otherwise known as SIDS, are a group of about approximately 52 countries scattered across the globe. For my research, I focused particularly on Caribbean SIDS within the Caribbean region, but SIDS are also located in the Pacific, in the African and Indian Ocean, as well as in the South China Sea. So what are some of the issues that are particular to the Caribbean region are based around the fact that these islands are particularly small, and they've also got particular and unique and diverse rain seasons and also methods for collecting rainwater. So in the Caribbean, there are two distinct seasons. There's a dry season which runs from January through to April, and there's also the wet season which runs from June to November. And the primary source or the primary form of water for most islands either come from surface water storage or from groundwater storage. So volcanic islands like St. Lucia, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent rely 100% on surface water, and they use primarily sort of hydroelectricity and with a combination of gas and oil for the electricity supply. Islands such as Barbados and Antigua rely heavily on groundwater or salination. So this heavy dependence on rainfall as a source of water supply means that Caribbean islands are particularly vulnerable to any variations in rainfall and in rainfall distribution. So climate change influences or increases the vulnerability of the waterscape of Caribbean SIDS, particularly because of three important issues. These are sea level rise, temperature changes, and precipitation. Precipitation across the Caribbean region has already been recorded. The changes in precipitation across the region has already been recorded. There are increasing instances of drought and a decrease in precipitation overall. In addition to these climate challenges, the Caribbean region also is experiencing increases in population growth, increases in urbanization, and the Caribbean is also heavily dependent on economic sectors that are water intensive, such as tourism and agriculture. So this combination and obviously the increase in hurricane intensity in the region has resulted in tremendous damage over the last 5 years through tropical storms and tropical hurricanes. So Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Dorian are 4 recent examples. So the overall purpose for my project was to sort of examine the impact of climate change on the water resources of certain islands in the Caribbean, and to gauge the potential of rainwater harvesting as a form of water substitute. And so the objective was to sort of identify rainfall patterns over the last 10 years and to examine the potential of using ferrocement biosand water filters as a form of water augmentation. Rainwater harvesting has been traditionally used in the Caribbean for over a couple of hundreds of years, but the dependence on rainwater has dwindled over the last 50 years, particularly due to increasing urbanization and a change in Caribbean culture in general. The benefit of rainwater is to basically feel the urgent need to sustainably manage our freshwater resources, but also to find out a water alternative source, and that is basically decentralized, because in the Caribbean currently all of the water supply systems are heavily centralized. So any disturbance to the centralized water system means that across the island, households, businesses are left without a reliable source of water. So I chose rainwater harvesting because it offers, as I just said, a decentralized approach, but it's also a sustainable solution and avoids a lot of the financial constraints and environmental problems that is usually caused by your traditional or your conventional large-scale centralized approaches. So rainwater harvesting pretty simply means, it's a very simple technology which is used for collecting and storing rainwater usually from rooftops. This could be from a farm, a home, a commercial property. It's also used to collect water from rock catchments, and it uses simple techniques such as jars, pots, or more complex techniques which require some form of engineering. So each island is unique and different, and applying a method or technology for rainwater harvesting would be wise and beneficial if a more localized approach is used. So in this case, I chose to use ferrocement biosand rainwater filter. But before I get into this, I will show you, these are some of the images of a community in Massac in Dominica after Hurricane Maria. If you can have a close look at the images, you will see that there is significant damage. I think if you observe there, some of the blue lines running across the road in the dirt area. These are water lines and water systems which were damaged. There was a river which also flowed through that community, and you can see the destruction caused to, these are residential properties, the destruction caused to these properties as well. Electrical lines were also damaged, but in this particular image, I want you to, this was the only household in this area which had water, and they were able to have water, particularly because they had a water storage tank. But in the Caribbean, these poly tanks are particularly expensive, and they're not necessarily within the reach of many people who may not be able to afford it. So ferrocement water tanks, I felt this was the best option to use within the Caribbean region because the basic materials required can be locally sourced. A ferrocement tank requires a little bit of cement, sand, water, and aggregate, and it also uses cheap materials such as chicken wire and simple steel rebars. And the technology to construct these tanks are pretty basic, so it can be constructed from a household level. So these are some of the characteristics, and it basically allows, it allows communities, households, island states to provide a low cost and easy build solution to augment their water supply. The process for constructing it is also very simple, and the combination of steel and cement means that the tank is able to withstand earthquakes and strong hurricane winds. So this This picture gives a basic overview of a household rainwater tank. The first image shows a tank that is in the process of being constructed. The second image shows a tank that has basically been constructed already. If you look to the top of the image, you will see that the water is being collected from the roof surface. And when water is necessary or needed, the pipe, the household, people from the household will use water flowing from the pipe. The ferrocement tank I created also contained a biosand filter. The biosand filter is a basic sort of biotechnology where you put various layers of sand and gravel. The final layers of sand are located at the bottom of the biosand filter. The more coarse and bigger aggregates are located at the top. What this allows is for the water to be naturally filtered and to kill pathogens that may be located in the water. So this picture will show you a gradation of the biosand filter. As water seeps through the filter, processes such as predation occurs, and this kills microorganisms which may eventually provide or lead to pathogens forming in the water. It traps bigger particles such as leaves and bigger sand particles. The final layers of sand also absorb some of the pathogens, and some of the pathogens in addition get stuck there. And over a period of time, because these pathogens may not necessarily have an ideal environment for survival, they die. And so the eventual water that filters all the way to the bottom is safe and ideal for drinking and household use and household purposes. So in 2018, I went to a community in Grenada called Mount Fan, and I interacted with the community members, and I got permission from a particular household to begin the construction of a ferrocement biosand filter there. This is the residence where the tank was constructed. I interacted with local community members, and I got 2 volunteers to help with the construction of the tank. Again, the purpose for doing so was to sort of prove or to ensure that the tank could be built with a little bit of guidance by anyone in the community. So these pictures just sort of walk you through the process. As you can see here, you can see fine sand particles, a collection of aggregates. You can also see the mix being made. No cement has been added to that. Cement is only roughly 5 to 10% of the composition for the material needed for the construction of the tank, which helps to ensure that it's pretty cost effective. So this is one of the community volunteers ensuring that the rebars are being set up. The base of the tank has already been created through the use of a combination of ferrocement material, which is sand, aggregate, and cement. And the chicken wire is widely available across all islands, and they're pretty cheap. So that's been constructed right there. And then the ferrocement layer is plastered both inside and outside of the rainwater tank. And over the period of 2 years, I have kept in touch with that particular household to monitor how well the tank has helped to augment the water supply, and also to monitor whether or not the structure of the tank has been sound. The report has been positive to the extent that a project has been funded in collaboration with the Goldsmith University in London, England. And next year, a project is going to be implemented on the island of Dominica, where women farmers are going to be taught to construct the tank so that they've got a steady and reliable supply for agricultural purposes, so that when the increasing periods of drought come, there will be a sustainable and reliable supply. So that is going to happen in the summer of next year. That's my presentation, and this last image is an absolutely stunning view of the St. George's in Grenada. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah, for another great talk and for wonderful images to give us an idea of the work you're doing down there. We're going to now move on to Valerie Washington.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie Washington. I am a PhD candidate in Industrial and Operations Engineering at the University of Michigan. And today I'm going to be presenting a case study on the use of location data to evaluate departure times and the factors that influence them during hurricane evacuations. In the days leading up to Hurricane Matthew, 26.5 million people in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina received either hurricane or tropical storm weather advisory. These advisories, in addition to evacuation orders being issued, prompted many to decide to evacuate. This, however, weren't the only considerations that went into these decisions. Rather, there's lots of considerations that go into the decision of if and when to evacuate, and not all of these factors can be measured directly. Additionally, some of these factors have been shown to have conflicting effects in the literature. Even still, it's important to know when and from where evacuees will originate and what factors are driving those decisions. This allows for a spatial temporal approximation that allows planners to estimate and manage travel demand. Location data in particular has the opportunity to offer new insights into examining evacuation behavior. The use of location data in evacuation is a fairly new research area, and to my knowledge, there have been no studies looking at departure times in particular. My hope with this study is to complement traditional methods which use survey data to model individual household departure time selections. The goal of my project is to use location data to calculate evacuation departure times and to identify the predictors that are driving them. For this case study, I'm looking specifically at the metro areas of Orlando, Naples, and Miami during Hurricane Matthew. So for my dependent variable, I'm trying to measure the total number of departures from a census tract during a 6-hour time period. And I just want to stress with this slide that I am making aggregated approximations at the census tract level. This is primarily because I know information about individuals' locations, but not any other identifying information such as their demographics or any other choices that they may have made. Additionally, each approximation is for a single 6-hour time period, so there are a total of 4 time periods in a particular day. For the predictors, I considered different variables including demographics, weather advisories, evacuation notices, and power outages. Additionally, I used a lag variable of the number of departures in the previous time step. This allows me to account for the fact that this is time series data. I also included a log offset of the number of residents that I was able to identify in a particular census tract, just to account for the fact that that is different across the study area. So before I could calculate the departure times, I first had to be able to identify what residents were living in the area. To do this, I identified their home location as the place that they spent the most amount of time in overnight. So for this first step, I took those overnight locations and plotted those to a grid, and then tallied up how many individual points were recorded in each particular grid cell. Next, I identified which grid cell had the highest number of points. So in this case, the cell that's highlighted with the number 5, and then took all the individual locations recorded in that grid cell and all of the surrounding grid cells, and averaged the latitude and longitude of these points. And this resulting location was recorded as their home. Next, I was able to calculate the departure times of the residents, and the results are shown here in this graph, aggregated to the metro area metro area that they reside in. So I am defining for the purpose of this study an evacuation to be that the resident has been away at least a mile away from their home for at least a 24-hour period. And I'm using an evacuation period lasting 3 weeks, approximately 1 week before the hurricane, 1 week after, and then 1 week under normal conditions. So I used a hurdle Poisson model to make the estimations for the departure time selections. Hurdle models are two-part models, with the first part being the binary or zero model, and that answers the question, were there any departures from this particular census tract during this particular time period? And if the answer is yes, then the second part, the count model, answers how many departures were there. Next, I was able to generate 2002 models. One is the null model using no variables. The second is the all covariates model using all 26 covariates. And lastly, I generated 2000 models with using random combinations of variables. My point in doing this isn't to choose the best model, but rather to evaluate the different trends in the output. I did compare these models to models that would have been selected through more traditional approaches, namely through AIC and p-values as the selection criteria. And these models did follow the same trends as the ones that I'm going to talk about. One of the outputs that you can use to evaluate these models is log likelihood, where likelihood is a measure of the goodness of fit of the model. So I used a likelihood ratio test to compare these models to the all covariates case to see if they were a significant improvement. 16 of them were, which are highlighted in green on the screen. And for my discussion, I'm going to focus on the trends that I saw in these 16 models. So the first result that I would like to discuss is that a census tract was less likely to have departures as the number of power outages increased in that particular census tract. Additionally, the lag variable of the departures in the previous time step was significant in the zero model, but not in the count model. Therefore, this variable could potentially be an indicator of if a census tract is at risk and if it is safe to evacuate. Additionally, I noted that evacuations were more likely when a census tract was under an active flood watch, and also saw an increase in the number of evacuees from that particular census tract while that flood watch was active. And the last result that I'd like to discuss has to do with the effect of the percentage of households in a census tract with children that are related to the householder. So the higher that this percentage is in a given census tract, I saw an increase in the likelihood of there being evacuations from that census tract, but a decrease in the number of evacuees in a given time period. The literature does show that families who are separated during an evacuation will reunite first and then evacuate together as a single unit. So the results from my study could mean that families are leaving separately from their home and then meeting at a secondary location before then proceeding to evacuate together. But this is something that I would need to look into further. So having a better understanding of some of these factors, like those that I presented here today, can help planners to develop spatial temporal approximations of where evacuees are coming from. And with sufficient lead time, this could help with better adaptation of traffic control measures, as well as an approximation of when the latest possible time is to make such adaptations before travel demand exceeds capacity. For limitations, one is that not being able to determine how representative the demographics are of those whose locations that I have. Additionally, due to the ecological fallacy, it's difficult to compare the results of my research to previous studies, just because I can't make conclusions about the individuals based off of my approximations at the group level. For future work, I'm hoping to expand my study area to capture other places that were affected by Hurricane Matthew, as well as to try some nonlinear approaches. The hurdle model is a linear model. And by using nonlinear approaches, I'm able to consider some of the interactions between different variables. And lastly, I'd just like to thank the Bill Anderson Fund, the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, and the University of Michigan's Rackham Merit Fellowship Program. And thank you.
That was another great talk. Thank you very much, Valerie, and timely research as we expect the hurricane activity to start ramping up in the coming weeks and months. We are going to transition now to our final speaker of the session, and that is Alex White from Michigan State University.
Okay, so my presentation is about urban hazard trees. Are they, or urban trees, I'm sorry, are they hazardous or helpful? And the answer is certainly both. So most of us are well aware of the benefits of trees in our neighborhoods, filtering out pollutants, providing shade and reducing the effect of urban heat islands, making neighborhoods more walkable, and the benefits of those urban trees are numerous. But trees can also be hazards, as many of us have seen. They can fall and damage property, and they can harm humans in the process. So in forestry, we define a hazard tree as a tree that poses a level of risk to people or property that exceeds the tolerance of the property manager. And because of that, the definition of a hazard tree is actually really subjective. So the same tree might be considered hazardous in one place, but not considered a hazard tree if it were growing somewhere else. We've got a lot of threats to trees right now, and those threats are being exacerbated by climate change. So on the left is the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect that's come to this country and killed a lot of ash trees. Hurricanes and strong winds are also a threat to trees. There's also threats that have to do with improper planting and things of that nature. So when we evaluate tree condition, we're looking for different defects that might classify a tree as a hazard. So here's someone measuring the diameter of a tree, but when a tree is mature, we'll also look up into the canopy for damaged branches and other signs that the tree might become a hazard. So I have this and the following slide just to show some of the decisions that a manager might have to make. So this tree, you might think that we need to cut it down because it's in pretty rough shape and it's on a roadway, but this has actually been defoliated by a native pest and it's late in the fall. So that tree will actually regrow leaves and be fine in the next season. And then this tree here is the angel oak, and it's 400 to 500 years old. If this were growing in someone's yard, it would have been cut down a long time ago, but because it has such an aesthetic value in a park, they've put all sorts of supports in and done a lot to preserve that tree. So when we're looking at communities, trees sometimes might not be wanted by people who live in those communities. And it seems like anyone would want a tree in their neighborhood. But here on the left, you can see the sidewalk cracking. So sometimes residents don't want trees planted because they feel like the city is not going to maintain them. So when we're looking at removing or maintaining trees, a lot of times it's removal is the last option. So you might cut out a dead branch like the gentleman on the right, or this tree here with the two split trunks. We can do what's called cabling and put actually a metal piece there to connect those two trunks. And there are limited mitigation options for homeowners. So the cost of maintaining a tree, cutting down a hazard limb might just be a few $100s, but if a family doesn't have the money for it, then that can be a real problem for them, especially in the event of a hazard. So for my field research, I'll be walking through neighborhoods and looking for these trees on private property. There are programs available to help people maintain their trees, the street trees. The government does that, but when a tree is on private property, it's hard to get assistance to maintain it if it dies or becomes a hazard. So this summer, I'll be working in Lansing, Michigan on this study. And here we have the additional threat of snow load on trees, which can cause more tree failure. And then also in coastal North Carolina, where hurricanes are an additional threat to trees. So urban forest policy, there are a lot of different things that we can do to help homeowners deal with the trees that are growing on their property to keep that property safe. Tree inventories are one way, and those are definitely coming a long way technologically. Instead of having to spend all of the money to send a crew out on the ground, we're getting to the point where we can identify single trees with drone cameras. Maintenance assistance is something that would be incredibly helpful to homeowners, just having those few $100s to call a crew out and maintain a tree so that it doesn't fall on their home and become a problem. And then community engagement. There are a lot of kind of neighborhood level or city level programs. This picture is from the Greening of Detroit here in Michigan, and they train community volunteers to plant and maintain trees. It can also help people who are private homeowners so that if a tree is growing on their property and needs to be maintained, they know when to call an arborist. So the key takeaways are that there's a lack of financial assistance available for tree maintenance on private property. Falling trees cause a lot of damage each year, and that maintaining trees can prevent these injuries and deaths. And here's my contact information.
Thank you very much, Alex. Great presentation, and thank you to each and every one of our panelists who were able to share a very insightful amount of information about the research that you all are conducting. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'd like to ask that if anyone would like to ask a question, that you either take this time to share so in the chat box, and whatever comes up, I'll reiterate to our panelists. Or if you'd like to ask it yourself, you're more than welcome to raise your hand at this time. So any questions that you all may have are welcome now. And the first question that we have that's popped up is for Alex, and it's from Dante, who asked, will you consider including renters in your study?
Certainly. So that's actually one of the reasons that I chose to work here in Lansing, is it's one of a limited number of cities that actually requires a person who's renting out their home to register it with the city. And part of the process of getting your rental approved is that there aren't trees that are, or plants that are a threat to property. And the people who go out and do these inspections don't have any training on how to identify a hazardous tree. So I'm really trying to work with the city some. I've already started working with the city forester to try to use that project to influence the safety of rental homes.
Thank you, Alex. Our next question is for Valerie. Judith asked, are you using mobile phone data, and how soon are those data available?
I am using mobile data. I'm not sure for how soon, I guess, how long it takes to get it from Verisat. Is I assume what the question is. I unfortunately do not know the answer to that, as that was received before I started working on the project. But I could reach out to my advisor, Judith, and let you know.
All right, we have time for one additional question, but if you have questions that come up in the interim, please feel free to enter them into the chat, and we'll make sure that they're included, the answers are included with the recording of this. Our last question is for Farah, and I lost it, but essentially, okay. How long does it take to build the water tanks?
So you've got to leave a period of 2 to 4 days so that the ferrocement can actually cure. So the tank building process is, you could build a tank in like 3 days, but you've got to leave the tank for 2 to 4 days so that the cement cures. And that's just for a household, an individual household. But if you're building a bigger tank, like at a community level, then it might take you about 2 to 3 weeks to be able to use the tank. But the building process is pretty simple and straightforward.
Thank you. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question for Felicia. And that question is, could you talk some more about the collection of the letters for the qualitative aspect of your research?
Yeah, so the letters that I referenced in the presentation, those are incarcerated individuals who are in one of the 52 prisons across New York State, and they actually write letters to the Correctional Association of New York, and we collect those letters, tag those letters depending on the issue that they talked about. So the letters that I mentioned are the ones that were tagged as COVID specific. So they mentioned some aspect of COVID-19, whether that was lack of personal protective equipment, all the way to actually thinking that they might have been infected with COVID-19.
All right. Well, if anyone in the audience is anything like me, I'm sure you're feeling like we wish we had so much more time to ask our presenters so many more questions. Just phenomenal work. And so I'd ask that we'd all give our presenters one more virtual or maybe even a physical round of applause for the phenomenal work that they are doing. Many of our presenters, if not all, have provided their contact information and their presentations, and it should be available through the workshop website. So if you do have follow-up questions, again, last chance to throw them in the chat and we'll address them alongside with the recording. If not, please feel free to reach out to these scholars now before they're famous for the great work that they're doing. Ladies, thank you once again for your phenomenal research and for your awesome delivery of what you're doing. So proud of you and cannot wait for the scholarship to come from you all, both now and in the years to come. And with that all, may you all have an enjoyable rest of the workshop and an enjoyable rest of the week. And we'll look forward to connecting with you at some point in the future. Bye.
Sorry we didn't have more time for questions, guys. Your presentations were beautiful.
Thank you, Alex. This was great. I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Same. You guys had awesome presentations.
Everyone's presentations, between the delivery, the visuals that you all incorporated, it was top notch.
I'm so proud. It was wonderful. Just wonderful. I'm thrilled. Thank you, Asia.
Hey, Norma, thank you.
Hey,
Thanks for the vision.
I did my 5K this morning, you guys. Okay. See you later.
Hi, Norma.
Thanks, Norma.
Bye.
Norma.
Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and close this channel. Thank you. I absolutely agree. It's every bit of amazing as we thought it would be, as it always is. And I will circle back with you in a little bit just about any questions and stuff to give you a chance to answer. Sorry, these sessions are only an hour long today. That's just not enough time. But thank you again for being with us and for making the workshop what it is. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye, guys.